Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulika amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the introduction there. Whilst I am thanking, I would like to say I extend my gratitude and thanks to the Centre for the Study of Islam in the UK, particularly Dr. Sophie Gilliray and her colleagues, who made me feel very welcome here and have made it home from home. I'd also like to extend the thanks to the Cardiff Law School and back again to the Centre for the fact that to hold these sorts of seminars gives us an opportunity to for scholars and for academics to speak on Islam and particularly Islam in Britain. I'd like to move on, and if I move on to the next slide, please. And the specific area that I'm going to talk about today is the recent Hanafi fatwa in the British context. Before I move off the title, I would like to sort of explain the title in a bit more detail. First and foremost is the word recent. That should hopefully give the impression that the law, or as in terms of legal response or in terms of answers given, does change. For the fact that to use the word recent would suggest that time, context plays a part in how a mufti, a scholar of Islamic law, would issue fatwa. Why in particular Hanafi? Well, some may argue that many Muslims living in the UK tend not to or are not aware of ascribing to any particular law school. But if we look at the Muslim population that exists within Britain, most would have some links to the Hanafi law school, because the Hanafi law school was practiced both as a state and also as individuals within the Indian subcontinent, which includes Pakistan and Bangladesh, and also across parts of the Arab lands and obviously in parts of Africa. So Hanafi and the Ahnaf, or those people who ascribe to this law school, would make up the majority of Muslims living within Britain. Now this might be nominal in the sense that it's, you know, the law itself is not manifest. However, when it comes to the sort of usual in terms of births, marriages, divorces and even death, there is a certain methodology which is used, a certain principles applied, and those are linked to a particular law school's interpretation. So that's one of the reasons why it's key to discuss that. Fatwa, as I've already mentioned, are those sort of legal responses when a question is posed to a scholar as to what his view is on a particular matter. And the British context is relevant because to give answers with the text has to be related to the context, and that's a quite key thing which hopefully will come through the talk as we go along. The structure of the talk will be hopefully split into three areas. The first area that I want to cover is the role of a mufti himself in Britain in 2009, what his job is and how he goes about doing that job. Then it's a sort of a more of a quantitative study or overlook. I'm not going to stick my hand up in the air and say that it is actually precisely quantitatively a discussion on the questions which he will obviously go through and what sort of answers he will give. And then finally, it's a qualitative discussion on the questions. First and foremost, both literally and metaphorically, the mufti wears various hats. His role involved he could be the imam of a masjid, whereby he's required to lead the prayer. He's expected to particularly for younger children, is to teach how to recite the Quran so that the ability is there. Secondly, he's a counsellor when there's issues both within the family or the community at large or between two different communities, then he's involved in counselling. An adjudicator, where individuals may bring their case to him and say that I've been hard done by, or this has happened to me, whatever, and it's his job to solve that problem. He could also be an advisor and a teacher. And then there's two other, the last two, community leader and the one that will come apparent there, spokesperson. These two have more or less come about over the last sort of 10 years or so. This is particularly after 9/11 and 7/7. The Imam suddenly has this great responsibility posed upon his shoulder that he's now the community leader. He is now the spokesperson for the Muslim community, and he is supposed to know all these things and he is supposed to provide all those answers. But strictly speaking, his role is those first 5 points legally. That's what he's trained up to do. That's what whether he goes to various institutes which would instruct him. That slide has somehow disappeared the wrong way, but moving on. I think I might have gone backwards. So, yep, next one, please. So, what is a mufti? Well, the first and foremost is that he's legally qualified. A mufti would have to study up to 7 years just through the sort of Islamic principles. There's various areas he will study. He will obviously study language, particularly the Arabic language, where he will look at morphology and the grammar. It's very important if you're going to try to interpret God's word that you actually understand in the language that God spoke, which according to the Muslims is in Arabic. And likewise, law is derived from the hadith, which are the sayings of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So likewise, he has to be in a position to be able to interpret what the Prophet said. Once he's qualified, that's the sort of 7-year standard sort of course, and then he takes a specific or specification in law, takhsis as it's referred to, where he will have expertise on over 2 years or so studying the specific area of law, because as a scholar, he would also be expected to interpret or do tafsir of the Quran, tafsir meaning sort of commentary on the Quran. He will also study the six main books of hadith and various other areas. But the mufti's role is quite specific in terms of as a legal advisor. How does a mufti then sort of, there's that sort of qualification aspect of it, but then how does he move on from this qualification? Because there are many institutes, an individual could arguably study with one person, and that one person could give him the ijazah, the permission to now give legal advice. But how does the next stage come along? Well, the next stage is basically acceptance within the scholars already. And within the masses, because if he's accepted within the scholars' circles, I guess in a way it's an individual who's maybe studying for his PhD. Once his PhD is complete, two other individuals who already hold a PhD then sort of sit with him and discuss with him, and if they feel that he's of an adequate level, then he's accepted within those circles. The masses as well, because at the end of the day it's his responsibility to be providing a service to the masses, and if the masses feel that this individual is not adequate, or there's some irregularity, then slowly his reputation would die down until eventually it didn't exist. So reputation is quite key. He's a legal expert, and obviously he's a legal advisor. His job is to have an understanding of both usul al-fiqh, which is the legal theory, and also fiqh itself, which is the result of usul. As I've already sort of alluded to during the sort of early stages of this talk, is that Muslims now find themselves in different circumstances than their predecessors, whereby Muslims are now, even arguably, most Muslims are living in a minority situation, whereby they're living in secular democratic societies. And the traditional law schools are based particularly on Muslim majority states. So that the context is very much different. So there's a need for what's referred to as ijtihad. Ijtihad is sort of what you would call an individual applying his intellect and his legal ability to be able to reinterpret the sources, to look at the sources and see what's available to him or to her in order to find out what legal availability there is. But who should do this work and where? One sort of rhetorical statement more than anything else, could it be that you have traditionally trained scholars within a university environment who have that skill whereby they've already had the traditional training, so they already have access to the sources and are able to do so, and then also within the principles of a Western academic environment is learning the skills in order to be able to do that. But that's, I guess, something for debate. The mustafti is the individual who poses the question. So the mufti is the one who answers. The istifta is the actual question, and the mustafi is the one who puts the question. So who are asking these questions within Britain? So the first one I have there is what I refer to as public bodies. So a university, for example, an individual wanted good reason to take exams at home, a religious reason they wanted, and the university allowed them to take the exam at home if there was a good enough reason, so to speak. With a fatwa, that it's not sort of legally binding as such, but it's legal advice. With that fatwa, she was able to approach to a university which allowed her to take her exam at home. Her Majesty's Prison Service had many chaplains and obviously the reason why we have Muslim chaplains is the number of Muslims increasing in prisons. We have a now need for Muslim chaplains, but there's also a need now for Muslims wanting to practice or worship a certain way or eat a certain type of food or be able to do certain things. But it's not just a case where one individual makes a request. He then needs some sort of legal, some reason or some evidence to be able to carry that out. So questions will come in to say, what's the Islamic position, particularly from the prison service, saying what is Islamic position on this thing that this individual is asking for. School governors is another example. These are just 3 examples that I put down. There were school governors who were deciding to put a certain type of logo on the children's school uniform, but they had quite a significant number of Muslim pupils there, and they were wondering whether that would offend Muslims. So they wrote in to request whether that would offend Muslims. A Waqf Institute. So Waqf Institute is something that used to take place particularly in Muslim majority states, but does occur here in the West as well, where buildings or certain things are bought but then given to Islam. So like a masjid is not owned by anybody as such, or neither is a madrasa. It's really something which the community collectively have gathered their wealth and then bought something. Yes, there are trustees and committees, but it's something which is referred to as waqf. So many questions will come through from the masajid as well. So the issue of, for example, in this mosque was could we use a bank account which was interest generating in order to keep the funds of the masjid in there. So questions, clarification is required. And then obviously family law solicitors, one area of law which is generally practiced, if other than the others, is family law, whereby the issue of divorce and marriage. Divorce can take place Islamically, but then there's obviously a legal. When I mean legal here, I'm talking about English law. So in a way, a Muslim can, by English law, divorce his wife, but Islamically could still retain her, and that can cause problems. So you do get many questions coming in from family law solicitors, in what position is the marriage in. And then obviously from the general members of the community that the mufti will serve. So initially I will look at the sort of qualitative analysis of some of the questions. So what are the areas of questioning? First and foremost, these are the sort of 3 or 4 key areas, or 3 key areas that I listed, is religious positions on matters. And these questions are not just coming from Muslims, but they're coming from non-Muslims as well, to try to, either they're employers or they're colleagues, and they want to know what is Islam's position on a certain thing. So questions will come in based on that. Marriage issues and women's rights tend to come up quite a lot, and we will see that when we actually see the raw data. The reason being is that with the sort of patriarchal system which exists in most Muslim families, women tend to, or in certain situations, can have their rights not fully fulfilled. So they will tend to write, some Muslim women will write in and seek a fatwa in order to have something which is Islamically binding, to say, well, hold on, what you're saying here is cultural to either parents or to a husband. What you're asking me to do or not to do is a cultural thing. It's not a religious thing. And I have religious evidence to support what I'm saying. So you do see many questions coming in based on that area. And one which I just thought I would throw in there is that you do get even questions on dream interpretation. The reason why I thought I'd throw in there is because it's unusual, because the mufti's role is quite varied, where a person will have a dream and they will ask it to be interpreted. Now you may ask, that's a strange thing to ask interpreted, but the Holy Prophet Muhammad said that after me there will be no prophet, but there will be true dreams. And what he meant by that is 1/46 of dreams will actually be prophecies. So the Islamic view on dreams, I know that's kind of going on a bit of a tangent, and that's not really what the lecture's about, but the Islamic view is of deja vu is something that you've already dreamed about. And when someone experiences in real life, that was a prophecy of what was to come. And had the individual been in a sort of, not necessarily in a wake state, but in a more, woke up immediately after and recollected the dream and had it interpreted, then that dream would have given him some news of what is to come. Now one may argue, what is the benefit of that if Muslims believe in predestination? Well, predestination itself is something which can be changed. But I guess that's a lecture for another time. The questions of study. The questions of study, it comes in all manner, the ones, not the ones that I will discuss, but questions in general come in all manner of correspondence, whether it's email, text message, meeting someone in the corridor, meeting someone down the aisle in a supermarket. Questions will come in. I think it's got overexcited with the pressing of the thing. So questions will come in all manners and shape and size, but the ones that I'm going to look at today are those that were written in and not anonymous, because you can get a lot of questions which come in which are anonymous, which arguably for obvious reasons are. And the question then itself is replied either via email or via a website. So the ones that I will look at today are those which were written and not anonymous. And surprisingly, I guess for the purpose of statistics, there was only 200 received in 1 year. Now you might say, why wasn't there 206 or 210? I'm not prepared to answer that. So what I've done is I've kind of taken a stereotypical approach, and those which are highlighted in pink are those which had a majority of the questions coming from a female questioner, and those which are in blue are those which came in from a male questioner, and those which remain black are those where there was no sort of gender bias, or if that's the right word for it, in terms of the questioning being put forward. So we see in terms of source texts, there's a higher number of individuals who are male who wrote in regarding clarification on particular source texts. One can draw various conclusions from there. It could be that predominantly in this case the women were better informed and they didn't need to write in to a scholar to have source text clarified, or it could be that the males were more interested in having source text clarified. In terms of Waqf institutes, there's no females whatsoever who pose the questions of Waqf institutes, and 6 males. You tend to find generally that it's the males who tend to be the trustees and the committee members of masajids or various institutes, which could explain why majority of the questions are coming from men. Inheritance, it's a 9-to-1 ratio. Inheritance Islamic inheritance is different than sort of English law inheritance, in that it's split up in various ways, including the father, the mother, even the step brothers and sisters, depending on who's available at the time. However, the responsibility tends to fall on the eldest son, assuming it's the mother and father who've passed away. And therefore you can see that that could explain why it's a 9-to-1 ratio of males posing the question rather than females. When it comes to marriage issues, it's highly females and then males. The question being is, even within sort of culture as it stands at the moment, the male tends to have more of a free choice as to who he wants to marry, and the females don't have that free choice as things stand at the moment. So what they need is they need the support, an Islamic sort of support, to say that what they are doing or what they're asking for is not illegal as such, but it's just more of a cultural thing which they want to break out of, and that could explain that huge number, which also, if you look at the percentage of questions, it's 12%, which is the second highest number of questions which are requested. Dietary, it's sort of a fair split between the two, and it makes up 2.5% of the questions. Taqleed. Taqleed is the concept of accepting a school of law. So there are 4 schools within the Sunni, and there are 2 main schools within the Shia. If we just concentrate particularly on the Sunni for today's discussion, you'll find that the 4 main schools are the Hanafi, Shafi, Maliki and Hanbali. But there is now, particularly over the last 50 years or so, the concept or the notion that one shouldn't or doesn't need to adhere to a particular school of thought, and one can directly interpret the text, going directly to the source text, being the Quran, and going directly to the Hadith text, rather than using the traditional school's approach. And therefore this concept of what's referred to as taqleed, which is the acceptance of a jurist's view, is coming more into question. The hereafter, there seems to be an equal split between the two there. Women's rights, surprisingly no men asked about women's rights, or maybe not surprising, and quite a significant number of women did. Again, I will sort of remind you of the sort of things I said when we were discussing the marriage issues in particular. Contracts, so you can see this aspect of law is not questioned a lot, but even having said that, it's 2.5%. In terms of contracts that occurred between 2 individuals, whether they be Muslims or otherwise, in terms of either it could be a sale, it could be a purchase, it could be any form of involvement of transfer of goods or money. Employment, there doesn't seem to be that much of an interest in terms of asking questions regarding about employment issues. We then move on. Ritual worship, which you would expect is quite a significantly or the highest percentage of questions asked, because this is one aspect of Islam which people tend to practice, and therefore the questions are asked regarding that. The split is 10-26. It could be, again, that Muslims generally go to the mosque than women do. So those men have access to a scholar or the imam. So they can maybe pose their questions directly to the imam, whereas women don't have that opportunity. So they tend to use the written form to raise their queries. Medical issues and women's hair is a 6-6 split. I'm not going to discuss that. I'll see what sort of comments and ideas people have in their heads. Hair and pregnancy. Hair is the issue of the menstrual cycle that a woman goes through, and here again, as you can see, the split is predominantly a woman majority. Muslim non-Muslim relationships. It is asked, but it's a 2%, and again, it's predominantly males who ask that. Aqidah is the issue of belief, what an individual must believe in or not believe in. So it's theology in that case, and here you have, I would say, a fairly even split. Entertainment, men tend not to ask many questions about entertainment. It's a woman majority to 5-0, and this is generally because as Muslims first arrived on the shores of Britain, the main thing was to make sure the sort of bread and butter was right, or as I call it, the dal and the roti was right. Because once the dal and the roti is right, then you can start worrying about the kebabs and the samosas. If the dal and roti is not right, then there's no point worrying about the kebabs and the samosas. So the main thing was making sure there were masjids, there were mosques to go and pray at, that there was halal meat. So it was the key things were the basics that they needed. But as the Muslim community has grown and has developed, now it's a new area which Muslims are looking into is entertainment, one which is sort of legally acceptable. And that's slowly, as Muslims are developing and gaining confidence within the state they live in, it's now starting to come through. And I guess with time that will develop further. And then just as a catch-all, because I couldn't fit them anywhere else, we have the famous miscellaneous. So conclusions, if you can draw some conclusions from there, are the Mufti's role is a complex and demanding role, and in fact with issues like extremism and with issues that we're facing on a day-to-day basis, some of you may have seen on Panorama yesterday, the demand more on Islamic leaders or faith leaders or however way they're going to be described is increasing. So it's going to get more demanding and it's going to get more complicated. However, the poor Mufti, his role is very different. He's a legal advisor. That's his job. He advises legally. He has the skills to access the text, to interpret the text, and to contextualize the text. His job, arguably, is not necessarily to lead as a social leader. That's a job, I guess, for somebody else. But at the moment, it's falling squarely on the faith leaders, Islamic leaders. There still exists an interest in Islam for British citizens, and that's one key thing we've got to bear in mind here. These are not immigrants that predominantly we're talking about. These are British citizens, and this is their interest in Islam. So it's not as if we're talking about some other or some alien body which lives within Britain and applying an alien way of life. It is individuals who are born and raised in Britain and who are citizens of the state, but continue, Islam plays a role in their life. And it does cover a wide subject area. The questions were posed by both genders, and as we saw, there was more of a push towards one than the other, depending on what type of questions there were. And as we can see, the questions were related to individuals' needs and situations. It wasn't as if it was just a sort of a question just to ask for the sake of it. It was a question which applied to their life at that particular moment in time. So therefore, it was relevant. As for now, the qualitative analysis, the qualitative analysis, what I want to sort of talk about just before I start that is that I've already mentioned it a couple of times through the talk so far, is that Muslims find themselves in different scenarios living as a minority in Britain or in any Western country than they would have done or may do in a Muslim majority state. Having said that, with the impact of, and I use speech marks, say westernization, however we want to term that and define that, in now Muslim states, arguably some of the things we can be talking about could be as relevant to a Muslim living in Indonesia or a Muslim living in Pakistan. So even though the things that I'm discussing I'm particularly relating to Muslims living in the West, but with the spread of westernization, a good example I give is just outside the Haram in Mecca, you can get KFC within 3 seconds, and a couple of minutes down the road you can get the Pizza Hut. So it's it's everywhere, so to speak. So it may be that some of the things that we're talking about here are not just applicable to Muslims in the West, but it could be Muslims living in 2009. So what I want to talk about in detail is the supermarket and alcohol, and obviously the two related together. And there's two particular scenarios. But before I sort of move on to those two particular scenarios, there is a concept that I want to mention. First and foremost, a legal advisor's job is to issue fatwa, as I've mentioned throughout the talk so far. But there is another concept which exists, which is called taqwa. Now, fatwa is something which is legally binding. What I mean by legally binding is legal advice. Is no one, in a sense, binding it on that person. It's just that individual who receives that fatwa, whether he accepts it and then puts it into action. Taqwa is something which is an individual's piety. So a person may decide to do something not because it's sorry, let me rephrase that. Somebody may decide to not do something, not because it's impermissible, but because they choose to act on piety. I'll try to sort of give you an example. If, say, somebody wanted to buy a £100,000 car, legally speaking, Islamic legally speaking, there's nothing wrong with him buying a £100,000 car, as long as the money is earned is his money and he's using his own money to purchase it. But if he was to act on taqwa, he would say, well, hold on a second here, do I really need a £100,000 car? I could quite easily get a £50,000 car and donate that £50,000 to the poor in a developing world. Thereby, he's acting on taqwa. It's not that it's illegal what he thought that he was doing, it's that he wants to act on piety. The reason why he acts on piety is obviously the Muslim's belief is that there's a hereafter. In the hereafter, a person is rewarded depending on what he did. So those things which are legal and illegal, obviously it bears its consequences, but those things where an individual acts out of piety, then obviously he's rewarded further because there was no legal reason for him to give what he gave up or to not do what he did or to do what he did. He just did that out of basically his own desire to do so. So for that reason, I will discuss taqwa and fatwa as we go along through these scenarios, and I just wanted to introduce that before we move on to them. The first case is if an individual was an owner or the purchaser. So say an individual owned a supermarket. Obviously we're referring to a Muslim here who owns a supermarket. What would be his situation? So the scenario we're putting forward is an individual is a supermarket owner and he's deciding to stock alcohol or stock beer, stock wine, stock spirits, stock whatever he wants into his establishment. Is that legal for him? He's living in Britain. The evidence is quite clear. There are a number of verses in the Holy Quran which I've just referenced there, not because it's not relevant, but because as a traditionalist, as one who adheres to a school of law, it's the school of law's opinion that has to be put forward first, because it's the individuals who have already carried out the ijtihad, those who have already done the istinbat, where they've already extracted the law from the Holy Quran. They've already extracted, that bit has already been done. There's no need for somebody now in 2009 to go back and say, is drinking beer legal according to Islam? That has already been done. His job as a traditionalist is to look at what his school's view is. It's only on those matters where the school has not spoken. So for example, say the use of marijuana or something like that, where the school would not have spoken of, and neither has the Quran, then he will look at different methodologies to use in order to do that. So there are many hadith which speak of that, and the hadith actually speak of not just the individual who drinks it, but the individual who grows the grapes with the intention of selling it to make alcohol, including the individual who then loads it onto his van, including the individual right up to the point where it's actually poured for him. So the whole process, the Holy Prophet speaks against it. But in terms of the Hanafi, because that's the law school we're talking about, there are a number of main texts that I've mentioned there. Radul Muhtar, again, volume 10, page 34, Badai Sanai, and Al-Hidayah. Three main texts which the Hanafi experts use in order to find out what the school's view on this, makes it absolutely categorically clear that it's impermissible for him to do so. Taqwa is not relevant, because if it's illegal, piety just doesn't come into the equation whatsoever. There's no point, he's not acting. But what about, okay, so taqwa doesn't come into it because it's irrelevant. If something is illegal, there's no issue of piety here because it's absolutely illegal. But what about that individual who is an employee and he works for, say, being from Bradford's or Morrison's, and he's sat on the till, and as he sat on the till, somebody approaches the till and they've bought, say, bottles of wine, and whatever else, what's his scenario? Now if we look at the verse in the Holy Quran, we can see that there is لا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان. So do not assist one another in ithm and udwan, in sin or evil. And here, if one was to use the source text, one would see that in this particular case, according to Islamic law, drinking alcohol is impermissible, is regarded as a sin. So if one individual is sat at the tail, particularly he could be involved in, or he could feel that he's partaking in that. However, if one looks within the Hanafi law school, and this is by Ibn Abidin Radul Muhtar, where he cites Al-Khaniya, there is a principle which says, لا بأس به لأنه لا معصية في أين الأمل. And what that means is لا بأس به, there is nothing wrong with that, لا بأس. Why? Because لأنه لا معصية في أين الأمل, because indeed there is no sin في أين الأمل, in the actual act itself. The actual act is he is sitting at his checkout and he's checking the food through. That's his job. So if we look at that, that was particularly, and there's also a view where in terms of Abu Hanifa actually permits it, whilst the other two here are the two students, Abu Yusuf and Mohammed al-Shaybani, the three mainly are behind the Hanafi law school. He permits it whilst the other two object. So the Hanafi experts living in Britain now can take that view of Abu Hanifa and say that that individual who is within that circumstance will be permissible for him to carry out his job. However, if he chose with his employer's wishes, then he could, and I've seen this happen several times, where he presses the buzzer and the little sort of white light flashes and somebody else comes along and dispenses and deals with that. If his employer is happy with him doing that and he wants to, then there's nothing wrong with him. He can act upon taqwa and choose not to do so, which can sometimes get complicated because say, well, hold on a second here, we had a Muslim working here and he was fine with doing it. As soon as you've come in here, you're just being awkward. Is some people can act upon the fatwa, some people want to act on taqwa. They have that choice as Muslims to be able to do that. Now, this particular scenario, one can take that principle and apply that principle in a number of other cases. If, say, an individual is a cab driver and he picks somebody up and he's dropping people off, he may feel that, hold on a second, if I'm taking a person to this place, I may be partaking in the sin because I'm assisting them. Likewise, an individual who wants to lease out his property, but the only people who approach him are those who want to open a casino there. So he thinks if I rent this property out and there's gambling here and there's people committing this sort of sin here, then that sin will be upon me. If we look at that principle, la ba'sa bihi, there is no sin because the ayn al-amal, the actual act he's doing is just leasing out his property. He's not going to be held accountable for what practice or whatever goes on in there. So that principle can quite easily be applied in a number of other situations. So conclusions. So Islam as interpreted by the Hanafi law is inherently flexible. It has a number of areas, something referred to as istihsan, something referred to as al-urf, whereby the scholars have the ability to contextualize the law as it's being interpreted. There are certain things which are immutable. There are certain things which are fixed, but there's certain things which are allowed to take into consideration the customs and the culture of in the context that Muslim is living in. There's also a clarification we need to make here, which is the Sharia is divine. It's free from error and it's relevant to all circumstances, people's times. Because why? The Muslims' belief is that the Holy Quran was the last book to be revealed and that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was the last prophet to be sent. By that fact, as Muslims take it, there is no book to come after and there is no man to come after, which means God will no longer speak to man. Which then means that that book must be applicable to man till the day of end of days. It has to be applicable because there is no book to come. In terms of Isa, Jesus, when he came, there was a book and a man which came after. In terms of Musa, Moses, when he came, there was a book and a man which came after. So there was always been a succession of prophets and books. But according to Islamic belief, according to Islamic creed, Prophet Muhammad was the last prophet and his book was the last book, which must mean that God must have foreseen, being God, that people will be different, there'll be different cultures, there'll be different societies, there'll be different ways of life, which means the Sharia must be as applicable. The fiqh, however, is different. The fiqh is the scholars derived law from the divine sources, applying certain premises, procedures, and principles. And that is what we're talking about here, where the contextualization is taking place, where the jurist, the scholar, has the ability to go and look and contextualize the law so that it's applicable to them, whether they're living in Britain, in the North Pole, or in Japan. So, as a summary and just to finish off on, fiqh not only can but should change depending on circumstances. However, having said that, this must exclude ta'abbudi, ritual worship. We can't solely decide, okay, 5 times a day is a bit too much, let's reduce that to 3 times a day prayer. Or fasting a month is just a bit too long, why don't we just do it for a week? Or there's no point going to perform Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, why don't we just go to Bradford or something like that? You know, certain things we just can't change. Certain things are what's referred to as ritual worship, ta'abbudi, those are fixed. They are not things which will change. But the fiqh itself that I'm talking about is what comes under mu'amalat, which is social affairs. How Muslims, in terms of transactions, in terms of work, in terms of way of life. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Shaykh Amjad, for your informative, rich lecture. I would like to open the floor to questions, discussions.
Sometimes I say the fatwa is used for political or personal gain. So as Muslim, how can we identify those fatwas and how can we deal with that?
I think if you look at historically within Islam, that's always been the case, where certain caliphs, certain sultans have used or employed the services of certain scholars in order to justify what they did, whatever. That is something which is part and parcel of Islamic history. It's again where I go back to the sort of reputation thing, where it's up to the Muslim scholars and the masses of the day to speak up and deal with those sorts of things themselves. It's historical, I guess it will carry on, but that does not stop the scholars of the time and the masses of the time, the lay person, if I can use that term, to be looking at addressing that and tackling that.
Thank you very, very much for such an interesting presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. I could have listened to lots of other cases and examples, but I just wondered if you could give us a sense, because this is the sociologist in me really, wanting to find out just how many other scholars there are like yourself who are kind of British born and trained, who have this immense legal knowledge, because I feel that perhaps there aren't so many, but I thought you may know.
There are scholars who are out there, but I think you've kind of touched upon something whereby it's knowing the culture, and when you're from a different culture, you can struggle to contextualize what the law is saying, and that has been the case, I think, for some time. In terms of numbers, it's hard to say how many there are, but I'm fairly confident that there are some. Now, whether that's significant enough, whether that's significant enough to make a change or to address all the issues, I can't say. But I would say that there is a significant sum. I can't give you numbers. What do you want, 12? No, I can't give you numbers. It's hard to say. I would just say a significant sum.
Very little.
Sorry?
Very little.
Significant sum. I stay on that.
Yes, please.
It's just some addition to this question that can I have some more introduction of yourself? Where you were trained as Shaykh, where you were qualified.
Okay.
As,
Okay.
From where your religious qualification comes, so that I could contextualize all your talk.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the religious aspect of it, as I mentioned and touched upon in the talk, legal qualification, if we go back traditionally, a student would approach a sheikh, study a text with him, and once the sheikh felt he was adequately able, would say, I give you ijazah. That's it. He has now given him permission to teach that text. It's as simple as that. It's a very simple relationship which exists between a teacher and a student. In terms of the course that I attended, it's a 7-year course with 2 years specialization in fiqh, which is a qualification of mufti. And what you cover is, you cover language, as I've hinted at, you cover usulul fiqh, which is the principles, the sort of legal theory, you cover usulul hadith, which is the principles of hadith, you study usulul tafsir, which is the principle of tafsir, you study Quranic tafsir as well, so you study a number of tafasir, you then study the 6 books of hadith, which is Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, Ibn Majah, Nasai, Tirmidhi, you study all those, and you also study many books of fiqh, so you study Quduri, Hidayah, you study for a long time.
That's done in Britain.
That's done in Britain.
Yes, please.
I appreciate that what you said about the process of recognition by fellow scholars must operate as a certain sort of guarantee of consistency in the teaching of different teachers. But we all know that in the secular academic world, people can respect each other as good scholars while still disagreeing profoundly.
Yeah.
And so recognition alone cannot really create any sort of hierarchy of authority, if you like. So is there any way in which a Muslim or an institution seeking guidance can either discern discern a hierarchy, if you like, between what different authorities are saying, can say, well, X says this, but is it a matter of numbers? Is it a matter of what sort of resonates best with the person's own understanding? Is it a decision that a particular community will follow a particular school of law and not another school of law? How does one distinguish between what different scholars are saying in obtaining guidance for oneself?
If I answer that with 2 answers. The first one is if you look at it as an institute. How does an institute know in terms of who to approach when? In Islam, there is no hierarchy, so there's no grand mufti and sub-mufti and not so good mufti. That's it, it's a qualification. Once an individual has that qualification, he is, as Islamic sort of law allows, able to practice law, if I can use that word. And that's his job to do so. How does he continue to exist? Well, if his work is... Now, there's difference of opinion and, legal sound difference of opinion, and then there's sort of what a person could be sort of completely uttering rubbish. It's quite clear for scholars, able scholars, to pick up on that. So where there's a difference of opinion, that exists within, say, the Hanafi law school, irrespective of, say, the Shafi law school and the Hanafi law school, it exists within the Hanafi law school. But what we're talking about particularly here, because when you're looking at the social aspects of how Muslims are living now, there's very little work being done on there. In terms of now Muslims living in Britain, what's the social phenomena, the social environment Muslims find themselves in is now different. Who should be researching in that area, who is looking at research in that area, that's not really happening, which is why there's sort of, I think, the 3rd or 4th slide along, I posed the question, need for ijtihad, who should be doing it, and I sort of said rhetorically, maybe traditionally trained scholars within a university environment. Nobody is doing that at the moment. Why? Because at the moment, when an individual qualifies from a Darul Uloom or from anywhere in particular, then his job is very specific. He's there to lead prayer. He's there to pray over the dead. He's there to visit the sick in the hospital. That's his job. It's not his job to be expounding on the sort of legal theory and looking at the context and developing that. That's not the sort of work which is ongoing within Britain at the moment. When there is that sort of work ongoing, there is some work of it in the States, and there is the European Fatawa board which exists, it tends to be Muslims who are not European by birth as such, and who have spent a great deal of their life outside of Europe, maybe in the Arab lands or in the subcontinent, who are then trying to understand the context in which they are issuing fatwa. So it's a niche, it's a vacuum, and it's something which needs to be filled in, but who does it, how it gets done, when it gets done, with whose help, that's a bit more up in the air.
Yes, I just have a question on the breakdown really. You put up your slide about the numbers, the different kinds of cases that you've encountered, the 200 really. And So you've given us a breakdown. It's very interesting to look at the subject matter. I was just wondering, I know that it's anonymized, your sample, for, I think, very good reason. I was wondering if you could give us some idea about the age range, actually, not so much the gender allocation of the questioners, but really the age, if you have any idea.
Well, it's fairly easy because the age range is very wide.
Right.
It spreads
It's
from...
not skewed either to say younger or older in any way.
Not as such. However, what you tend, here these questions are posed to me. So I tend to draw individuals who are similar,
Right.
who see that, hold on a second here, we believe so-and-so can understand our context better. So you tend to get more young, if I can call myself that, sort of British-born individuals who will write in and ask. That doesn't mean you don't get the sort of other end of the scale. But you would argue that generally it's sort of individuals who kind of can relate to me and say, well, hold on a second here, we feel this person could answer our question. But it's quite wide, which is why having access to other languages, Urdu or Pashto or Arabic is also useful, because particularly those who have ethnicity that's from the subcontinent, that some may not speak in the English language. So you've got to be able to link to that.
You mentioned the Panorama program yesterday, and there you get the idea that the government was talking to all these muftis and whatever, but the people they showed were quite old, and you got the feeling that they weren't second generation Muslims, they were people who'd come over here themselves. And do you think that that is the right thing, that the government should be taking the help of these people? Specifically, maybe community elders, maybe in the 50s, 60s, and the problem, especially the way Panorama presented it, was like young British Muslims. And so that's one question. Do you think these people should have that role, have the government approaching them? And also, you mentioned yourself that only in the past 10 years has their role come to include stuff like being community leaders. And do you think that should be Mufti's role? Because again, like you said, that it's relevant to like this is a complex role for British people. And again, maybe these people don't understand it. And like you said, he wouldn't give a solid sum of how many young Muslims like you who've been educated here who maybe would understand this better. So there aren't that many. So do you think that they should be community leaders, or do you think there should be kind of other people set up to be community leaders and a division should be drawn?
Going back to the Panorama, which was yesterday, as I mentioned to Sophie earlier as well, I was disappointed because I think it was very poorly researched. It was very piecemeal. It was trying to get a certain point of view across, which is not the right sort of point of view, and I don't agree with it. In terms of who should the government be speaking to, I would suggest that they should speak to as many people as possible. Not just so-called community leaders, but they should try to get a wide sort of berth so they can get as many views on board. If they're looking then for legal expertise, then they need legal experts. It depends what they perceive as the problem, assuming they do perceive a problem. So it's what they perceive as a problem, and then it's what they feel are its solutions. So if they feel, from what I can understand, they feel religion has a big part to play, whether positively or negatively, they feel any extremism which is going on has some sort of religious element to it. I hope that it means it's a misconstrued religious element to it, and they understand that, and they're trying to sort of address that. So in answer, they need to speak to as many different types of people, Muslims, experts on Muslims, academics, people who are doing actual research, and people who are involved and on the sort of community floor, so to speak, on the ground, on the grassroots level, and then take that forward. But I don't really think that there's a quite clear message coming from the government as to what they really want to do, what they want to achieve, and why they want to achieve that, in what manner they want to achieve that. If it's a case of religious training or religious teaching, then they should be working with those individuals who are imparting religious training and religious teaching. If it's to do with masajids, with mosques, then they need to approach the committees of mosques or those umbrella organizations that sit over. It depends what they're trying to achieve. At the moment, from my understanding, I can't really understand what what they are trying to achieve at the moment, apart from Muslims or certain types of Muslims or certain views within Islam are problematic.
Do you find there's a big gap between Islamic law and, say, the English law? Like, I'm currently writing something about the Divorce Religious Marriages Act. I'm guessing you might have heard of this one, where a divorcing couple can apply for a order that prevents the full decree absolute in state law until the religious divorce has been granted. It was stated in Parliament recently that no Islamic groups have actually applied to be classified under the use of these provisions. Is this something, do you have any idea what this is? Is it because there's a divide there? Is it, and they'd rather go to an informal court and have it done essentially that way, or?
I don't think there is. You know, there are many number of organizations that exist, sort of Muslim organizations or Islamic organizations that represent Muslims. That's a sort of job for them, really, because but again, they've got to be working with sort of legal experts or legal advisors to say, you know, what sort of numbers of individuals do you get asking for divorce? You know, what is it on grassroots? What's happening? When they know that and they understand that, then they can say, well, hold on a second here. From our research, from our work, it seems to suggest that there's, you know, divorce rate is going so high. There's problems because the man divorces his wife through the legal English courts, but not then through Islamic law. And then there's the woman is as what's referred to as mullaqat, where she's just sort of stuck in a hung marriage, and then he can do as he chooses, but she's sort of, you know, left high and dry. And that's then for these organizations to say, well, hold on, that's a problem within the Muslim community. We can't have that. We can't accept that. So therefore, we need to now work with the government, whoever else, in order to eradicate that, so that sort of thing doesn't happen. It's not for one individual or such, or a few people banding together to do that. It's those umbrella organizations that exist within Britain. There's many of them, so we don't need to set another one up, that can represent Muslims on a level for Muslims in Britain.
Yeah, I have a question about computers. I'm wondering if the internet has made the job of a mufti in Britain more difficult, because people can email, you know, the same question, get different fatwas, and then choose the one that they like the best. Have you encountered that at all?
Yeah. Well, what I refer to Google is Shaykh Google, because you don't need to ask a mufti anymore. All you do is ask Shaykh Google, and Shaykh Google will tell you what the answer is. Yeah, I guess it's one of the things with technology. You know, there's a plus side and a negative side. The plus side is the mufti now has a wider audience to you know, put forward his teachings and his views. But on the other flip side of the coin, shopping for a fatwa has become quite prominent, where a person will go approach, well, I don't really like that one, write it there, copy paste, send it out, and then once the answer comes which you want, which fits in with your whims and desires, brilliant, I'll accept that. So that's not really getting a fatwa as such. It's just something which is appeases one's sort of guilt that at least I am acting upon. So there are pluses and negatives to that.
Questions? I will ask a question. Can the fatwa change from one, you know, the response of the fatwa can change from one person to another? So for example, if I ask a question, will you give me different answer if another guy asks the same question?
There are certain questions which are generic, and those sorts of questions can be applicable to anybody. But then there are certain questions which are not as generic and they're specific to each individual. Those sorts of questions are not ones which I tend to put onto the Fatawa websites or given out on sort of public information, because of the fact that it's a specific case. So depending on the context of an individual, it can change. A good example, say, which I know it's sort of a bit of a radical example to give, but hopefully it'll sort of exemplify what I'm saying, is that, say, the eating of something which is illegal. Now, if somebody generally asks the question, can I eat, you know, a burger from McDonald's, say, living in Britain, then the answer would be, no, you cannot. But if that individual is starving to death and the only thing in front of him is that burger, then for that particular person, you say, of course you eat it, never mind eat it. It's actually necessary upon you to eat it. So it's gone from completely illegal to it's now become absolutely necessary for you to eat. So that law has changed. Now, if you put that fatwa out onto the website, then you say, oh, brilliant, I've now got a fatwa, which means I can go to McDonald's, print that off quickly, photocopy that and circulate that. So the specific ones are given specific. It's usually the general ones which are put out there so that the other individuals can take benefit from them as well.
Just wanting to, I was wondering if you could expand on when you were introducing the title, and you said that most Muslims in Britain aren't actually aware of what school of thought they belong to or what they're following.
Yeah.
And I'm one of those Muslims. I mean, it was started working on the project and they came the whole school of thought issue came up, and it's an explicit question now on our interview schedule, and we left it at the end because we find that it does confuse some people. Some people haven't even heard of the word school, the term school of thought. I was just wondering why there is such little understanding of something like that.
Well, it kind of goes back to where majority of Muslims have come from in terms of emigrated from, and what you find is that the majority Muslims tend to have come from sort of village lifestyles, rural areas where arguably literacy was not very high. So the background itself, the economic background, the educational, the social background that they're coming from tend not to be talking about law schools and talking about that. It was just what Imam Sahib says. So whatever Imam Sahib says, I don't even know what Imam Sahib is, but I go to the masjid, whoever he is, that Imam Sahib, my father's known him, I've known him, whatever, I ask him, and that's it, and that's good enough for me. So the issue of are you Hanafi, are you Shafi, whatever, that's not something which is going on. However, if you look, say, across the Arab lands, it's different there. There, most individuals do tend to know which school of thought they are. I would just say it's a socio-economic phenomenon than anything else. Things are changing now amongst the younger generation, where they do know whether they're first of all muqallid or ghair muqallid, and whether then they're Hanafi or Shafi or Hanbali or whatever. And they know that according to my school, I pray like this. According to your school, you pray like this. So those things become different. Those things become apparent rather as time goes on. A person can change his school of thought if he was to travel somewhere where, say, for example, he was adhered to the Maliki fiqh, and then he went somewhere and the majority of the inhabitants there, and likewise the scholars there were Hanaf, then he or she could change their school of thought because of the fact that it would be easier to consult a scholar of that particular school of thought rather than trying to consult somebody else. So there are grounds for it. However, obviously, like the question was raised there, you can't find that, oh, wait a minute, it's easier according to the Maliki school if in this particular episode. So what I'll do is I'll adhere to the Maliki school of thought for the next 3 months, and then once I'm no longer doing this, and then I'll go back to Shafi or to Hanafi. Again, that's clear. We may be able to kid ourselves, but as Muslims, we believe God sees all, and therefore we're held accountable.
Last question.
So, as a follow-on from that, for people who don't know the school of thought and when they choose to, how do they go through the process of choosing school of thought? Do they study it? Do they go to a scholar, an alim of that school?
It's better for them to go by the expertise within their locality. With the people that they will sit with, because at the end of the day, they'll be praying by a certain way, they'll be fasting according to a certain way, so it'll be much easier. And likewise, the scholars within that particular locality will be of a particular school of thought, so it'll be much easier to adhere to that school of thought, because the view is that the 4 schools of thought are correct amongst the 4 schools. So it isn't as if Imam Malik was wrong and Imam Abu Hanifa was right. The view is that they were correct. Or as the principle goes, that our jurist was correct with the possibility of being wrong, that jurist is wrong with the possibility of being correct.
Any more questions? Shall I ask one more question?
You've had more than your fair share.
Okay.
Oh, go on.
About, do you think that according to Hanafi madhab about halal mortgage, or about mortgage, do you think there's halal or non-halal mortgage, or it's all?
There's been a lot of work, I think, and the financial market, I guess, is relevant to our time now in the recession that we're in. But the financial sector, obviously, capitalist views that it is, has realised that there is a lot of capital that exists within Muslim pockets or Muslim lands, which could be utilized to further develop capitalism and move forward. So there are certain products which are coming online, sort of Muslim Islamic mortgages and whatever issue. Some of them, I can't talk specifically, but generally some of them are. So you have tawakaful and various other methodologies which are used to make it legally valid. Some aren't, and as one scholar explained, the best way he could describe it was that imagine you're parked at red lights and there's a petrol station on your left hand side, so you go through the petrol station to miss out the red lights. So strictly speaking, what you've done is not 100% legal, but it's as best as it is at the moment. So some are in that stage and some are moving towards being 100% Islamic, if there is such a thing as 98% Islamic.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for answering the question and answer.